Wonderful. So, long and short, what we've learned is that in a competitive market, the wage and employment level are going to be set by the interaction of supply and demand, right? Wages are going to be set at a level that equalizes supply and demand, and the employment level that comes out of that interaction is going to be economically efficient, right? Working more or working less would result in aggregate losses to society, right? Benefits to one side would be smaller than losses to the other side. Wonderful. So what we're going to do now is we're going to think about how our market equilibrium is going to change when we take various policies that mess with it a little bit, right? So to start out with, we'll start with something that you might have seen before, which is the effect of subsidizing earnings on this story, right? So we can imagine a much, much simpler version of the earned income tax credit, where we again want to provide income to low-income households and also encourage work. And we're going to do this in this case by just adding $3 to whatever employees are paid, right? So we're going to say simply ITC is just going to be a $3 wage subsidy so as a result, employees are going to earn W plus $3 per hour. Wonderful. So how is this going to affect labor supply? Well, what our labor supply equation is telling us, right, is the dollar value of each hour of leisure to the worker who would choose it, right? In other words, what it's telling us is that if we supplied 90 hours of work, right, that 90th hour is going to be worth to us $9 an hour, right? At a wage of $9 an hour, we're willing to work 90 hours because that 90th hour is worth $9 an hour to us. So if that 90th hour of work is worth $9 an hour to us, and we're getting a $3 an hour subsidy from the government to work, how much would you have to get paid by your employer in order to work that 90th hour? Well, you should be willing to work for a total of $9 an hour. It's not really important to you who's paying you, right? You might not even know. What you care about is at the end of the week, on your W-2, what's the amount written down? So if that's the case, we're going to expect you to be willing to supply the same amount of labor at $6 an hour as you used to be willing to supply at $9 an hour, right? And likewise, you should be willing to supply at $9 an hour the amount of labor that you used to be willing to supply at $12 an hour, right? In other words, your new labor supply curve should just be 10 times W minus 3. I'm sorry, W plus 3, right? Because your total earnings are going to be W plus 3 times the number of hours you work, your real wage rate, right, the wage that goes into your pocket, is whatever your employer is paying plus $3 extra. This makes sense? How about labor demand? Well, if I'm a demander, it doesn't change anything about my problem. The fact that my employees are getting an extra $3 an hour from the government, right? That doesn't change the revenue I get from employing an extra worker one bit. So our new labor market equilibrium is going to be where labor supply equals labor demand, right? It's going to be where 10 times W plus 3 equals 270 minus 20W, right? Which is going to mean 10W plus 30 equals 270 minus 20W, which means that 30W equals 270 minus 30, right? W is going to equal 270 divided by 30, which is 9, minus 30 over 30, which is 1, right? Which is going to be 8. So, what's this mean? It means that the wage rate, as a consequence of the fact that labor supply increases, is going to decrease from $9 an hour down to $8 an hour. Now, at a wage of $8 an hour, we're still going to have employees bringing home right? 8 plus 3 is going to be $11 an hour. So employees are going to have an increase in earnings as a consequence of this, an increase in wage as a consequence of this, but it's going to be a little smaller than the increase we would have expected given a $3 subsidy, right? Instead of adding $3 to their wage, we're only going to add $2 to their wage. Now this is also going to change the number of hours worked, right? We're going to say that our labor supply at a wage of 8 is going to be 10W plus 30, it's going to be 80 plus 30 equals 110. So essentially what we're going to say is, right, our new equilibrium here, we're going to have 110 hours worked at a wage of $8 an hour. Make sense? So is this going to increase or decrease economic efficiency? Well, it's got to end up decreasing economic efficiency, right? Because essentially what we're saying here is, whereas 90 was the efficient number of hours worked, right, we've now got employees working 110 hours. That 110 hour that they're working is only worth $8 an hour to their employer, right? But the value of that leisure hour to them was $11 an hour, right? So society would be in some sense $3 an hour better off, or $3 better off, if that 110th hour had never been worked. This make sense? Now, kind of cool thing you might have seen before is that our conclusion isn't going to change one bit if instead of subsidizing the worker, we subsidize the employer. In other words, if instead of a policy where we add $3 an hour to the employee's paycheck, we'd instead given a $3 an hour subsidy to the employee, right, as a bonus for hiring a worker, we would have gotten to the exact same earnings, exact same revenues for employees as we got in the last problem. So to walk through this, let's imagine what our labor demand curve is going to be for an employer who's offered a $3 an hour subsidy. Well, what it means that this employer is willing to hire 90 workers at a wage of $9 an hour is that their 90th worker is bringing in $9 an hour worth of revenue, right? They're making $9 worth of stuff. They're making stuff that costs, let's say they're preparing $1 yogurt parfaits, they must be preparing 9 of them an hour. Make sense? So how much is this employer going to be willing to pay the 90th worker now that they're getting a $3 an hour subsidy? Well, now their revenue is the $9 an hour of stuff the worker's making, plus the $3 an hour in government subsidy, right? So this worker is actually bringing in $12 an hour of revenue for them. So instead of being willing to pay them $9 an hour, they're now going to be willing to pay them $12 an hour, right? In other words, their labor demand is going to be 270 minus 20 times W minus 3. Why minus 3? Because whatever wage rate they pay, what they've paid after taking into account the subsidy is W minus 3. Right? When they're paying $12 an hour, they're actually only out $9 an hour. Make sense? So then when we set supply equal to demand, right, we're essentially going to say 10W is going to equal 270 minus 20 times W minus 3. Yeah, so then we're going to say 30W is going to equal 270 minus 60. So W is going to equal 9, right? 270 divided by 30 minus 2. Oh, I'm so sorry, plus 60. 9 plus 2, which is going to get us to a wage rate of 11. Now, as you might recall, $11 an hour is exactly as much as workers were receiving after receiving their EITC subsidy. In other words, the effective wage going into workers' pockets is still $11 an hour. How much are employers actually paying? Employers are going to pay, right, $11 minus the $3 subsidy, which is going to be a wage rate of $8 an hour. Exactly the same as they were paying when the employees were getting the subsidy. And how many workers are going to work? Labor supply is going to be 10W, so it's going to be 110. Exactly the same solution as before. So what's actually going to determine who's getting the subsidy? Right, if it's not whose pocket the money is being placed in by the government? What's going to determine who gets the subsidy is going to be the relative elasticity of supply and demand. The idea here is, essentially, we're going to shift along our supply and demand curves until the gap between supply and demand is equal to $3 an hour, right? Until there's a $3 wedge here between our original supply and demand curves. How much higher our wage rate is going to depend on how steep the supply curve is relative to how steep the demand curve is. If we had perfectly elastic demand, right? Let's say we had labor demand like this, labor supply like this, then a $3 an hour subsidy would have to come exclusively, would go exclusively to $3 subsidy would go exclusively to employees, right? We wouldn't have any change in the wage rate at all. So the subsidy would go entirely to employees. Why would that be? Because the additional employees being hired are worth exactly the same amount to the firm as the original employees being hired, right? So because their marginal revenue product isn't falling at all, their willingness to pay isn't changing at all, and there's going to be no sharing of the subsidy between employees and employers. On the other hand, we have a perfectly inelastic demand curve, right? And a supply curve. We give our subsidy to our employees, right? In this case, employers aren't willing to hire a single extra worker, so employers would get 100% of the subsidy, right? We would have a decline in wages exactly equal to $3 an hour. Okay, beautiful, beautiful. Wonderful. So to recap, right, all we did to think about how a wage subsidy or a wage tax would affect labor supply or labor demand is we said, instead of a W here, we're going to replace our W with whatever the real cost or the real benefit of a worker is, right? So we subtracted $3 when we subsidized wages from employers, added $3 when we subsidized wages for employees. Now, this is pretty useful, and I want to use it to look at a slightly different category of government policy, which is mandated benefits from employers. The idea here is that in a lot of cases, rather than just trying to provide direct wage benefits, right, subsidize or tax the dollar earnings of employees, governments put rules in place about what sorts of amenities or values employers have to provide for their workers, right? So the government might, for example, mandate that all employees have a certain amount of health insurance, or they might mandate that all employees be provided with certain safety equipment, or that employees get mandatory breaks and lunch hours. How can we think about how these types of policies are going to affect the supply and demand and equilibrium wage of labor? So to do this, essentially we want to do exactly the same thing. We want to ask, how do these policies change the cost to employers of a worker? How do these policies change the benefits to employees of working an hour? So let's start out by imagining that the government requires all employers to provide health insurance, which costs $5 a work, right, per day. And let's say now we're going to have number of workers here instead of number of hours. It'd be a little slipshod, right? So we don't have to think about part-time versus full-time employees, anything like that, right? So how's this going to affect our demand for labor? Well, before, right, the cost of hiring an extra worker was the wage W. Now the cost of hiring an extra worker is the wage W plus $5 per worker, right? So our new labor demand curve is going to be 270 minus 20 times the total cost of the worker, right? W plus 5. Make sense? So what's this going to do? It's going to shift our labor demand curve down by $5 an hour, right? So if I used to be willing to hire 90 workers at $9 an hour, now I'd be willing to hire 90 workers at $4 an hour. Make sense? And if this is all that happened, right, if this was the only effect of a health insurance policy, then we would expect that fewer workers would work, right? They would work at lower wages, we would end up in an equilibrium here. It would be just like the problem we just did. But this is missing a really important element of health insurance, which is that health insurance isn't just valuable for employers, it's also going to be valuable for employees. So let's imagine, for now, that for an employee, the value of having access to health insurance was also $5, right? In other words, we can imagine that if an employee was given a choice between a job paying $9 an hour with no health insurance or $4 an hour with health insurance, the employee would be indifferent between the two jobs, right? They'd be equally happy with both. If that's the case, how does this policy change our labor supply curve? Well, if before I was willing to work at a wage of W, right? So the 90th worker was willing to work at $9 an hour. Now I'd be receiving that $9 plus 5, right? So I'm going to be willing to work, that 90th worker should be willing to work for $4 an hour. In other words, my labor supply curve is going to shift down by $4 an hour, by $5 an hour, right? My new labor supply curve should be 10 times W plus 5, right? The value of my total compensation. And what's going to be the total effect on the number of workers? Well, in this case, the total effect is 0, right? Because employers valued the cost of the employers was $5 an hour. The value of the employees was $5 an hour. The consequence is going to be, we're going to have exactly the same number of people working as we did before the policy. The only effect of the policy is going to be lower our equilibrium wage from $9 an hour down to $4 an hour, right? If we really wanted to, we could prove this with a little bit of algebra, right? We could say labor supply equals labor demand, 10 times W plus 5 has to equal 270 minus 20 times W plus 5, right? So this is going to tell me 10W plus 50 equals 270 minus 20W minus 100, right? 30W is equal to 270 minus 150, which is going to be 120. W is going to equal 4, right? The number of workers is going to be 10 times W plus 4, plus 5, so sorry, which is of course going to be 90. Right? Make sense? Great. Now, of course, in this case, right, with the example here, we're assuming that the value of this policy to employers and employees is exactly the same, right? That employees value the policy at $5 an hour. Employers have a cost of the policy of $5 an hour. I'm going to have you in your worksheets for today's lecture think through a situation where these two values aren't the same, right? In particular, a situation where employees value the mandatory policy or mandatory benefit at a lower dollar value than the employers, than the cost imposed on employers to provide that dollar benefit. The other situation, of course, where employees value it more than employers, we're going to talk about a little bit later on. The basic idea there is, if that's the case, then employers should have provided that benefit without the government ever having a mandate, because it should have been cheaper for them to offer, let's say the healthcare cost them $3 and had a $5 value to employees. It would be cheaper for them to offer healthcare than it is to offer wages. Cool.